Hey, it's Kyle here, and today I'll be reviewing a very interesting nonfiction book, The War of the Roses by Dan Jones. I've read some of Dan Jones's books before. I've always enjoyed them a lot. Was very excited to read this one. It's a period of history I'm very interested in, and I really enjoyed this one a lot. If you're not familiar with the historical event called The War of the Roses, you might be more familiar with it than you realize because it's inspired a lot of work of fiction. A lot of the events of the War of the Roses were kind of used as a loose inspiration for the events in Game of Thrones. So if you've watched that show, read those books, some of the historical inspiration for those stories actually come from this period of English history. And there's been a lot of other works of fiction and nonfiction based on this, other than Game of Thrones, which, again, drew loose inspiration from this. For more fans of the classics, various works of Shakespeare are set during this period. A lot of the popular views of the various kings and individuals involved in this period of history are really shaped by how Shakespeare depicted them. So if he depicted a certain king as a villain in his story, that's how it's kind of viewed today. If a certain one is more heroic, that's how it's kind of viewed today. Might not necessarily be how it is viewed during the actual events of the thing, but Shakespeare's portrayal of those individuals involved really shaped how they were viewed going forward. And as you might imagine, as a historical event that inspired, in a lot of ways, Game of Thrones, a lot of fighting, a lot of bloodshed. No dragons, though, so that's a little bit of a difference. But on to the actual event, if you're not really, have no idea what the War of the Roses are, basically from the mid-1400s to the early 1500s, there was not quite non-stop, but pretty close to non-stop civil war after civil war, where various individuals who had a claim on the English throne were fighting over it. One person would win it, and as soon as he won it, the other people on the other side would quickly try to overthrow him. A lot of times they would succeed, and then you'd get coup, counter coup, coup, counter coup, a person becoming a king, losing the crown, then becoming a king again in a year or so. Various families involved, noble houses aligning on one side of the Civil War and then quickly switching to the other when they thought the tides were turning. Very chaotic time, a ton of people dying in battle, nobles being executed. One of the most chaotic times in English history for sure. And Dan Jones does a great job of summarizing this and kind of presenting what actually happened, the historical facts, the individuals involved, exploring why certain individuals did what they did, what their motivation was. The entire crisis that starts the War of the Roses is because the House of Plantagenet, which had been ruling England for a long time, is probably best known for being the rulers during the 100-Year War with France. Basically, the last ruler of that dynasty, Henry VI, was very ineffective and basically was incapable of ruling on his own. He initially inherited the throne when he was basically a kid, but even when he grew into adulthood, he did not have the capability to rule. And the English system of governments did not work if you had a king who was completely incapable of ruling. And basically this began a series of events that started individuals either trying to rule in his name, or other ones like, all right, England's fallen to chaos, we're losing all our lands in France, the country is just falling to the wayside, somebody needs to step up. And so then you initially had various individuals just trying to not necessarily seize the throne, but basically gain control of Henry VI and basically rule in his name to kind of restore order. But eventually, things happen. The first person takes that final step and says, like, I'm going to proclaim myself king. And that starts really the chaos, where once one person decides to overthrow a king, then everybody else is like, well, if I have any ounce of royal blood in me, why can't I do the same thing? And that's why you end up with 70, 80 years of nearly non-stop civil war in England. The main families fighting over is the House of York, which kind of controls the throne for the most of the War of the Roses. You also have the House of Lancaster, who are the main rivals for the House of York. They don't tend to control the throne as much as York, but they're heavily involved. And basically these two families just fight. All the noble families that align with them, are, like I said, constantly switching hands. But you have all these powerful noble families in England who, ruled certain sections of the countries for generations, are basically completely wiped out by these series of conflicts. And at the end, neither of these houses end up winning control of England. We get a new dynasty, the House of Tudor, that eventually wins this or brings stability back to England and kind of merges York and Lancaster, even though they have very loose connections to both of those. And we eventually get a little bit more stability in England. The War of the Roses come to an end. I'm not going to get involved in all the individuals involved in this. Again, like I said, if you've seen Game of Thrones, if you've read Game of Thrones, you kind of know, like, there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of fighting, a lot of death, a lot of betrayal. The way that Dan Jones writes, I think you're going to find this more interesting if you're into reading nonfiction. This is, I would say, maybe not a good book to read if you're typically more into reading novels, reading fiction. You're like, oh, maybe I want to dabble into some nonfiction. I think this is really initially a good entry point into reading nonfiction because there's a lot of historical names, a lot of dates, a lot of talking about battles and stuff like that. Like, some people who are typically not into history begin to get lost in. On the other hand, if you're really into history, if you love reading nonfiction, I think this is a book you can kind of read. It's like, I want to read about the War of the Roses and get a good summary of it. This gives you a good overview of the entire conflict. Now, because it's covering the entire conflict, it's not like you're getting 200 pages per battle or event. You're getting the basics of it. It's more general info. But, when you're trying to cover an event that took place over nearly a century, you can't delve into every event in complete detail. A lot of these battles, various rulers, deserve their own book. But when you're doing this overview, this War of the Roses really gives you a good overview of, like, hey, this is what happened. Here's the key individuals involved. Here's the mistakes that were made. Here's the brilliant strokes of warfare that allowed certain people to win battles and claim the throne for a while. This is where they made a mistake and lost the crown. All that type of stuff. Dynastic marriages, families, all that type of stuff. So again, I would say, like, if you're a history nerd, if you like reading about history, but maybe you've never read anything about the War of the Roses, I would really encourage you to read this. It's a very interesting read, very well written. The only thing I struggle with is nothing with Dan Jones's fault. Is at this point in time in England, they didn't really seem to mix up the names a lot. So there's a lot of Edwards, there's a lot of Richards, there's a lot of Henrys. And so, and on both sides of the fighting, so a lot of times, you might have the same name leading the various rivals. You have to go like, well, which Henry is this again? Which Richard is this? Which Edward? Which side is this in? It was very hard to keep track of. There is a family tree in the front of the book for all the families involved, and honestly, the family tree is very confusing. And I think it's just a way of them showing, like, hey, even people at that time, it was very hard to keep track of, like, the various ways people were claiming through blood right they had a claim to the throne, because it gets very convoluted. It's not very straightforward. But other than the confusions with the names and just trying to keep track of all that stuff, I didn't really have any issues with this book. I really enjoyed it a lot. It definitely makes me want to read more by Dan Jones. This is my third book of his I've read. I definitely want to read more. So again, if you like reading history, I think you'll enjoy War of the Roses by Dan Jones. I highly recommend it. Let me know in the comment section below if you've read any of Dan Jones's books. If you have, which ones would you recommend me check out next? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button. If you haven't, please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate the support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you the next time, and happy reading.